Imagine an empire so vast that its flag flew across every continent, its rulers commanding oceans, trade routes, and millions of lives. They said the sun never set on it. But in just a few decades, this empire, the greatest the world had ever seen, began to crumble. 2 world wars would shake its foundations, draining wealth, tearing apart its colonies, and shattering the illusion of invincibility. This is the story of how the British Empire, once the unchallenged master of the globe, fell, not with a single blow, but with the long shadow of global conflict. At the dawn of the 20th century, the British Empire stood as the largest and most powerful empire in human history. It was an empire so vast that it covered nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and governed almost 1 in every 4 people alive. From the icy waters of Canada to the deserts of Africa, from the bustling ports of India to the islands of the Pacific, the Union Jack flew over territories that spanned every continent. This was the age when Britain described itself with pride as the empire on which the sun never set. The scale of British power was unmatched. Its navy ruled the seas with a dominance that no rival could seriously challenge. The Royal Navy, at the start of the 20th century, maintained a fleet larger than the next 2 navies combined. It was the ultimate guarantor of Britain's strength, protecting trade routes, colonies, and the island nation itself. Warships flying the white ensign could be found in every ocean, policing global waters and projecting imperial might. This naval dominance was tied to the empire's economic supremacy. Britain was the workshop of the world, an industrial powerhouse whose coal, steel, and textiles supplied markets far beyond Europe. The port of London was the beating heart of this economic system, with ships unloading goods from India, Africa, and the Caribbean, while sending out British manufactured products to every corner of the globe. Banks in the City of London financed global trade, and the British pound sterling functioned as the world's most trusted currency. The empire was not just a matter of military and economic strength, but also of culture and ideology. British political leaders and intellectuals believed in the civilizing mission of empire, a paternalistic idea that justified colonial rule as a force for progress. The education systems in India and Africa were designed to mirror British institutions, while English law and governance were exported across the colonies. The ideals of parliamentary democracy, the English language, and British customs were imposed upon diverse peoples, often without their consent, but at the height of its power. The empire was also riddled with contradictions. Beneath the grandeur lay deep inequalities. The wealth of the empire flowed overwhelmingly toward Britain, enriching its cities, aristocracy, and industrialists, while colonies provided raw materials and cheap labor. In India, millions lived in poverty while the empire extracted cotton, tea, and opium for global trade. In Africa, colonial administrations imposed taxes and forced labor to maintain control. Still, in the early 20th century, confidence in the permanence of empire was nearly universal among Britain's ruling class. Queen Victoria had died in 1901, and her long reign had given the empire a sense of continuity and destiny. Her successor, Edward VII, inherited an empire whose rulers believed it to be the very center of the world. London was the capital not just of a nation, but of a vast global system of governance, commerce, and culture. The Edwardian period, though short, reflected this sense of grandeur. British elites celebrated imperial exhibitions that displayed the products and cultures of the colonies as trophies of dominion. In 1911, the Festival of Empire at London's Crystal Palace allowed visitors to wander through pavilions representing India, Canada, Australia, and Africa. It was designed to showcase the unity and strength of Britain's empire, a spectacle of power that reinforced the belief that this system would endure forever. Yet the empire's size also created vulnerabilities. Governing a quarter of the globe required immense resources, constant communication, and the cooperation of colonial subjects. Nationalist movements, though still small at the time, were beginning to stir. In India, the Indian National Congress had been founded in the late 19th century and was slowly building a voice against British dominance. In Ireland's resentment against centuries of English rule persisted, with demands for home rule rising in the early 20th century. Internationally, rival powers were also on the rise. Germany, newly unified and rapidly industrializing, was beginning to challenge Britain's economic and naval supremacy. The United States, once a colony itself, had emerged as an industrial and financial giant, with ambitions of its own in global affairs. Japan, after its victory in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, demonstrated that an Asian power could defeat a European empire, sending shockwaves through the colonial order. Still, in 1900, few in Britain imagined that their empire was in danger. To them, the future seemed secure. The empire's communication network, including the telegraph and an extensive system of railways in colonies like India, gave the impression of modern efficiency and control. The British monarchy, draped in the ceremonial grandeur of empire, provided a unifying symbol for subjects across the globe. Even in distant colonies, images of royal coronations and jubilees reinforced loyalty to the crown. Economically, Britain was still unrivaled. Its industrial cities, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, stood as monuments to the wealth generated by empire. Coal mines in Wales and shipyards on the Clyde supplied the raw power for global trade. Colonial resources fed this machine: Indian cotton for the mills of Lancashire, Malayan rubber for the booming automobile industry, African gold and diamonds enriching British coffers. The ideology of empire was reinforced through education and propaganda. British children grew up with textbooks that celebrated imperial heroes like Cecil Rhodes, Clive of India, and Lord Nelson. Maps of the world coloured vast regions in red, symbolizing British control. In the colonies, schools taught English literature and British history, creating local elites who were both beneficiaries and critics of imperial rule. The pride of empire extended into daily life. Tea from India, sugar from the Caribbean, and spices from Africa filled British kitchens. Exotic goods became ordinary household items, tying everyday life in Britain to distant colonies. The empire shaped diets, fashion, and even language, embedding its reach into the cultural fabric of society. But the very confidence of this age concealed its fragility. The empire was heavily dependent on the loyalty of colonial subjects and the stability of global trade. Any disruption, whether from war, rebellion, or economic crisis, could threaten its balance. Yet in 1900, such threats seemed distant. The empire appeared to its rulers as eternal, an unshakable order that defined the modern world. By 1913, on the eve of the First World War, the British Empire reached its territorial peak. It controlled nearly 35 million square kilometers of land and ruled over more than 400 million people. It had outlasted rival empires in Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands, and seemed destined to continue its dominance into the future. The illusion of permanence was powerful. Few recognized that the very forces that had built the empire, industrialization, global trade, military expansion, were also creating conditions that would test it to its limits. New competitors, restless colonies, and the pressures of modern warfare would soon converge. Within a generation, the empire that had appeared eternal would begin to unravel. The early 20th century was the moment of greatest pride and confidence in the British Empire. It was also the moment just before the fall began. At the beginning of the 20th century, the British Empire appeared unshakable, yet beneath its surface lay tensions that would soon test its strength. The decades leading up to the First World War were marked by growing unease, both abroad and at home. While London projected confidence as the world's capital of commerce and empire, the reality was more fragile. Rivals were rising, subjects were restless, and the foundations of British supremacy were slowly being eroded. The empire's most immediate concern was the changing balance of power in Europe. For much of the 19th century, Britain had pursued a policy of splendid isolation, standing apart from continental alliances, while relying on its navy and empire to secure its position. But by the turn of the century, new forces threatened that isolation. Germany, unified in 1871 under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck and later Kaiser Wilhelm II, had transformed into an industrial powerhouse. Its factories produced steel, chemicals, and arms on a massive scale, while its population surged. By 1910, Germany rivaled Britain in industrial output, and its leaders believed that a global empire was the rightful reward for their newfound strength. Nowhere was this rivalry more evident than at sea. The Royal Navy had long adhered to the two-power standard, maintaining a fleet at least as large as the next two navies combined. But Germany's naval expansion under Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz challenged this supremacy. Beginning with the naval laws of 1898 and 1900, Germany launched a program to build a modern fleet of battleships, known as dreadnoughts. These vessels, equipped with heavy guns and advanced armor, represented the cutting edge of naval warfare. Britain responded in kind, commissioning its own dreadnought in 1906, a ship so advanced that it rendered previous warships obsolete. The result was an arms race across the North Sea, one that drained resources and heightened suspicion. Britain was not blind to the growing threat. Diplomacy shifted accordingly. In 1904, the Entente cordiale with France marked a departure from centuries of rivalry, establishing cooperation against common dangers. 3 years later, Britain and Russia resolved their disputes in Asia, completing the alignment of powers known as the Triple Entente. By 1910, Britain was no longer isolated, but instead bound to France and Russia in a fragile balance against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and their allies. Yet while Europe prepared for conflict, the empire faced challenges within its own borders. In Ireland, demands for home rule had grown louder. Centuries of tension between Protestant Unionists and Catholic nationalists had left the island divided. The British government introduced Home Rule bills in the late 19th century, but fierce opposition in Parliament stalled reform. By 1912, the Third Home Rule Bill reignited the debate, provoking deep divisions. Unionists in Ulster, supported by armed militias, vowed to resist any attempt at separation, while nationalists saw Home Rule as the first step toward independence. The prospect of civil conflict on Britain's doorstep cast a shadow over the empire's domestic stability. In India, too, unrest was brewing. The Indian National Congress, though initially dominated by moderate voices seeking reform within the empire, began to radicalize. The 1905 partition of Bengal, engineered by the British to divide Hindus and Muslims, sparked widespread protests. The Swadeshi movement called for boycotts of British goods, and demonstrations grew increasingly militant. Leaders like Bal, Gangadhar, Tilak, and later Mahatma Gandhi embodied the growing dissatisfaction with imperial rule. Though Britain maintained control through its military and bureaucracy, the demand for self-determination was becoming a powerful undercurrent. Across Africa, resistance to colonial rule also surfaced. In South Africa, the aftermath of the Boer War, 1899 to 1902, revealed the costs of imperial ambition. The war, fought between the British and the Boer republics, had been brutal, involving scorched earth tactics and the use of concentration camps for civilians. Though Britain emerged victorious, the war tarnished its reputation and exposed the harsh realities of empire. Elsewhere on the continent, revolts in Sudan, Nigeria, and East Africa challenged British authority, reminding London that imperial control was far from absolute. Even within Britain itself, the social fabric was under strain. The early 20th century saw growing demands for labor rights, women's suffrage, and political reform. Strikes by dock workers, miners, and railwaymen shook the industrial order. The suffragette movement, led by figures like Emmeline Pankhurst and the Women's Social and Political Union, turned increasingly militant, chaining themselves to railings, smashing windows, and staging hunger strikes in prison. These struggles revealed a society grappling with profound change, even as its leaders insisted on projecting imperial stability. Meanwhile, the empire's economic foundations were beginning to shift. Though Britain remained a leading industrial nation, competition was fierce. Germany and the United States surpassed Britain in steel and chemical production, while American oil and automobiles pointed to new industries where Britain lagged behind. Global trade remained vast, but Britain was increasingly reliant on imports of food and raw materials from its colonies and dominions. This dependence made the empire vulnerable to disruptions, a fact that naval strategists never forgot. The dominions themselves, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, were loyal but increasingly self-confident. They had gained significant autonomy through responsible government and were developing distinct national identities. While they remained tied to Britain, their willingness to sacrifice for imperial causes would soon be tested. The empire was no longer a simple hierarchy of colonies and masters, but a more complex network of relationships. By 1910, signs of the coming storm were everywhere. Britain's leaders debated how to manage a world that seemed increasingly unstable. Some, like Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey, recognized the dangers of German aggression and the fragility of peace in Europe. Others clung to the belief that Britain's empire and navy would deter any challenge. The coronation of George V in 1911 symbolized continuity and tradition. Yet, behind the pageantry, the uncertainties of the modern world loomed large. The empire still projected immense power. The Royal Navy's fleets patrolled the seas. The City of London financed global trade, and colonial governors maintained order across vast territories. But beneath this surface, cracks had begun to show. Nationalist movements, industrial competition, domestic unrest, and geopolitical rivalries were converging. The illusion of permanence, so strong at the empire's zenith, was already fading. The 20th century would not be an age of uncontested British supremacy. Instead, it would be a century of struggle, as Britain fought not only to defend its empire, but also to preserve its very place in the world. The storm had not yet broken, but the shadows had lengthened, and the first tremors of global conflict were already being felt. Within just a few years, the empire would be plunged into the greatest war it had ever faced, a war that would mark the beginning of its decline. The summer of 1914 began, like many others in Europe, warm, busy, and seemingly ordinary. But beneath the surface, the continent was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The British Empire, at its height, watched cautiously as rivalries deepened, alliances tightened, and national ambitions collided. Few realized that a single assassination in a Balkan city would set in motion a chain of events that would not only plunge Europe into war, but also alter the fate of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo by Gavrilo Princip, a young Bosnian Serb nationalist. What might have been a localized crisis quickly escalated. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany, issued an ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia's partial rejection led Vienna to declare war on July 28. Within days, the alliance system drew in the continent's major powers. Russia mobilized in defense of Serbia. Germany declared war on Russia, and soon after on France. By August, German troops crossed into neutral. Belgium and Britain could no longer stand aside. Britain's commitment to defend Belgian neutrality dated back to the Treaty of London in 1839. But it was not just treaties at stake. German domination of Western Europe and control of the Channel ports posed an existential threat. On August 4, 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. The greatest empire in history was now fully engaged in a conflict that would soon become global. The announcement of war was met with scenes of patriotic enthusiasm across Britain. Crowds gathered in London, cheering the declaration. Men rushed to enlist, believing the war would be short and decisive. The first volunteers of Kitchener's army filled recruitment offices, their posters urging them to serve king and country. Newspapers spoke of honor, duty, and the defense of civilization. But beneath the surface of this optimism lay the grim reality of what was to come. The British Expeditionary Force, BEF, a small but professional army, was sent across the Channel to join France and Belgium in halting the German advance. In late August, at the Battle of Mons, British soldiers faced the full weight of German firepower. Though outnumbered, their discipline and rapid rifle fire inflicted heavy losses. Yet the German advance was relentless, and the BEF was forced into a fighting retreat. This opening clash revealed the scale of the war ahead, a conflict unlike any Britain had fought before. For the Empire, the war was not confined to Europe. From the very outset, it became a global struggle. German colonies in Africa and the Pacific were targeted, while the Royal Navy imposed a blockade on Germany to choke off supplies. Britain's vast imperial network became both an asset and a necessity. Troops were drawn from across the empire. Indian regiments marched in France. Canadian battalions fought on the Western Front. Australians and New Zealanders prepared for campaigns in the Middle East. The empire was mobilizing for total war. The financial cost was immense. To fund the war, Britain turned increasingly to loans, particularly from the United States. By 1915, the empire was spending millions of pounds a day, draining reserves and pushing the nation into debt. This financial strain would have long-term consequences, undermining the economic foundations of imperial power. As the war dragged into 1915, the optimism of the opening weeks gave way to grim reality. Trench warfare defined the Western Front, with lines stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. Soldiers lived in mud-filled trenches, enduring artillery bombardments, machine gun fire, and poison gas. Casualties mounted at an unprecedented rate. Battles like Neuve, Chapelle, and Loos showed the futility of frontal assaults against fortified positions. Britain was learning that this war would not be won quickly. At home, the impact of war was felt in every household. Rationing, conscription, and the loss of loved ones transformed British society. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking on roles in factories, transportation, and agriculture. The suffrage movement, once militant, redirected much of its energy toward supporting the war effort. Though demands for political rights did not disappear, the empire's colonies bore immense burdens. India sent over 1 million soldiers and laborers, while also supplying vast quantities of food, textiles, and raw materials. In Africa, carriers were conscripted to transport supplies across harsh terrain. In Canada, the war effort deepened divisions between English and French speakers, while in Australia and New Zealand, the war became a test of national identity. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915, though a failure, became a defining moment for both dominions. By 1916, the scale of the war had grown unimaginable. The Battle of the Somme, launched in July, epitomized the carnage. On the first day alone, Britain suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, the heaviest loss in its military history. For months, men fought and died for yards of ground. The battle introduced new technologies, tanks, creeping barrages, and expanded air support, but none brought decisive breakthroughs. The Empire's young men were being consumed in a war of attrition. In Ireland, the war coincided with rebellion. The Easter Rising of April 1916 saw Irish Republicans seize parts of Dublin, declaring independence from Britain. Though the rising was quickly suppressed, the execution of its leaders fueled nationalist sentiment. At the very moment Britain needed unity, cracks in its domestic fabric deepened internationally. The entry of new powers altered the conflict. Italy joined the Allies in 1915, while in 1917, the United States entered the war after German unrestricted submarine warfare and the infamous Zimmermann telegram. America's industrial and financial might tipped the balance, but it also signaled a shift in global leadership. Britain was no longer the unchallenged center of the world. The final years of the war drained the empire further. In 1917, the Third Battle of Ypres, known as Passchendaele, saw men fight in seas of mud for minimal gains. In the Middle East, British and imperial forces advanced against the Ottomans, capturing Jerusalem and Baghdad, but at high cost. The empire stretched itself across multiple fronts, relying heavily on colonial manpower. By 1918, Germany launched a desperate spring offensive, hoping to break the Allies before American forces arrived in full strength. British troops bore the brunt, retreating under immense pressure. But by summer, the tide had turned. With American troops joining, and Britain, France, and the Dominions holding firm, the Allies counterattacked. The 100 Days Offensive pushed Germany back, forcing its surrender on November 11, 1918. Britain emerged victorious, but the price was staggering. Nearly 1 million British soldiers had been killed, with countless more wounded. Across the empire, colonial troops had died in Europe, Africa, and Asia, their sacrifices shaping political consciousness in their homelands. Economically, Britain was exhausted, burdened with debt and stripped of its former financial supremacy. The war had shaken the very foundations of the empire. It remained vast, but its image of invincibility was gone. the seeds of nationalist movements had been sown. The economic balance of power was shifting toward the United States, and the human cost had scarred a generation. The First World War was not just a military conflict. It was the beginning of the empire's long decline. What had begun with patriotic cheers in 1914 ended with a somber reality in 1918. The British Empire was victorious, but forever changed. When Britain entered the First World War in August 1914, few imagined that within months the Western Front would freeze into a line of trenches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. What had begun as a war of movement quickly became a war of stalemate. For Britain and its empire, the years spent in those trenches defined the Great War. They were years of mud, blood, an unrelenting sacrifice. The trench system was both a product of necessity and of modern firepower. Machine guns, rapid-firing artillery, and barbed wire made open-field maneuvers suicidal. To survive, armies dug in. British soldiers soon found themselves living in networks of trenches, front lines, support lines, and reserve trenches, connected by communication routes. The typical trench was about 6 to 8 feet deep, reinforced with sandbags and wooden planks. Dugouts provided some shelter, though often damp and cramped. In winter, the trenches flooded, turning into rivers of mud. Rats, lice, and disease were constant companions. Life in the trenches was monotonous yet dangerous. Long stretches of boredom were punctuated by sudden bursts of violence. Snipers watched every movement. Artillery barrages could arrive without warning. Gas attacks, first used by the Germans at Ypres in 1915, added a new horror. Soldiers wore crude masks or cloths soaked in chemicals to survive. The smell of decay was everywhere, with unburied bodies often lying just beyond the parapets. The psychological toll was immense. Soldiers lived under constant stress, knowing that death could come at any moment. Many developed what was then called shell shock, today recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Symptoms included tremors, nightmares, and paralysis. At the time, some were accused of cowardice, though the medical understanding of trauma slowly improved. Despite these conditions, the British Army continued to grow. Conscription was introduced in 1916, ensuring a steady flow of men to the front. Kitchener's army, the volunteers who had enlisted in 1914, now fought alongside conscripts. Entire communities in Britain were represented in the trenches, particularly through the PALS battalions, units composed of men from the same towns or workplaces. Their losses could devastate local communities. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, some towns in northern England lost nearly all their young men in a single day. The battles of the trenches became legendary for their scale and futility. At Loos in 1915, Britain used poison gas for the first time, with limited success. The following year, the Battle of the Somme was intended to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun. On July 1, 1916, British forces launched their assault. Poor planning and strong German defences led to disaster. By nightfall, nearly 60,000 British casualties had been recorded, including 20,000 dead, the worst single day in Britain's military history. The battle continued for months, with men advancing through mud, barbed wire, and machine gun fire. Tanks made their debut, but they were few in number and mechanically unreliable. By the time the Somme ended in November 1916, Britain had suffered over 400,000 casualties for minimal territorial gains. The battle symbolized the grim reality of trench warfare. enormous human cost for little strategic advantage. In 1917, the Battle of Past, or the Third Battle of Ypres, brought more suffering. The Flanders landscape, churned by shelling and heavy rain, turned into a quagmire. Soldiers drowned in mud as they attempted to advance. Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand troops played key roles in the fighting, highlighting the Empire's involvement. Though the Allies eventually captured Passchendaele Ridge, the cost was staggering, over 250,000 British and Imperial casualties, while the Western Front dominated attention. British soldiers also fought in other theatres. In Mesopotamia, they struggled against the Ottomans, suffering a humiliating defeat at Kut in 1916. In Palestine, they eventually captured Jerusalem, while in East Africa, small British forces pursued German colonial troops across vast terrain. These campaigns stretched imperial resources and relied heavily on colonial soldiers and laborers. The strain on the home front grew. Food shortages, rationing, and long casualty lists tested morale. Families received telegrams announcing deaths or injuries on a daily basis. Women took on new roles in factories, agriculture, and nursing, sustaining the war effort. The war accelerated social change, reshaping British society in ways that would last beyond 1918. In the trenches, innovation slowly emerged. Artillery tactics improved with the development of the creeping barrage designed to protect advancing infantry. New weapons, like the Lewis gun and improved mortar, gave soldiers more firepower. The tank, though limited in 1916, grew more effective by 1917 and 1918. Airplanes, once used for reconnaissance, began to engage in dogfights and ground support. But none of these innovations changed the brutal reality for the men on the ground. Progress was slow, and casualties remained high. The human stories of the trenches remain central to understanding the war. Letters home reveal the courage, despair, and endurance of ordinary soldiers. They wrote of mud that clung to every step, of comrades lost in shellfire, of the rare moments of camaraderie and relief. Some recounted the strange ceasefires, such as the Christmas truce of 1914, when British and German soldiers briefly fraternized, exchanging gifts and playing football before returning to battle. The toll of the trenches was not just physical, but generational. The young men who died represented the future of Britain and its empire. Communities were hollowed out, families shattered. The war poets, like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, captured the disillusionment of a generation. Their verses described the reality of gas attacks, the cries of the wounded, and the futility of sacrifice. They challenged the rhetoric of glory and patriotism, revealing the human cost behind the statistics. By 1918, after 4 years of grinding attrition, the British Army had become hardened and experienced. The lessons of the trenches prepared it for the final offensives of the war. Yet the price was staggering. Over 700,000 British soldiers dead, with millions more wounded or permanently scarred. Across the empire, the sacrifices were immense. India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Africa had all contributed men and resources. Their loyalty tested in the mud of Flanders and the Somme. The trenches were the crucible of the Great War, shaping not only military tactics, but also the memory of an entire generation. They symbolized the horror of modern industrialized conflict, where human lives were consumed on an unprecedented scale. For Britain, they marked a turning point. The empire had shown its ability to mobilize globally, but it had also revealed the fragility of its resources and the vulnerability of its people. When the guns finally fell, silent in November 1918, the trenches remained as scars across the European landscape. They were the graves of millions and the symbols of a war that forever changed Britain and its empire. The victory had been won, but at a cost that would haunt the empire for decades to come. When Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914, the conflict was never going to remain confined to Europe. Unlike other great powers, Britain's strength did not rest solely on its armies and navies at home, but on the vast network of colonies, dominions, and protectorates that made up the empire. For Britain, the First World War was immediately global, drawing in resources, manpower, and sacrifices from every corner of its dominion. It was a war not just for Britain, but for the empire itself. The empire stretched across continents, from Canada in the west to India in the east, from the dominions of Australia and New Zealand in the Pacific to colonies across Africa and the Middle East. Each was tied to Britain by bonds of loyalty, obligation, and governance. In 1914, when Britain entered the war, the dominions followed. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa all declared war alongside the mother country. India, still under direct colonial rule, became one of the greatest sources of manpower and material support. The contribution of India was enormous. By the end of the war, over 1.3 million Indian soldiers and laborers had served overseas, fighting on the Western Front, in the Middle East, and in Africa. Indian troops were among the first to arrive in France in 1914, holding the line during the critical early months of the war. They fought in battles such as Neuve, Chapelle, Loos, and Ypres, enduring the same mud, shellfire, and gas as their British counterparts. Over 70,000 Indians lost their lives in the conflict. Beyond manpower, India provided food, cotton, and financial contributions, raising huge sums through war loans. In Canada, the war became a defining moment of national identity. More than 600,000 Canadians enlisted, a remarkable figure given the country's population of just 8 million at the time. Canadian troops distinguished themselves on the Western Front, particularly at the Battle of Vimy Ridge in April 1917. There, 4 Canadian divisions fought together for the first time, capturing a heavily fortified position that others had failed to take. The victory came at a cost of 10,000 casualties, but became a symbol of Canadian nationhood, celebrated as proof of the Dominion's growing independence within the Empire. Australia and New Zealand also answered the call. Around 416,000 Australians and 100,000 New Zealanders served, many in the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the ANZIT Seas. Their most famous campaign was Gallipoli in 1915, when Allied forces attempted to seize control of the Dardanelles and open a route to Russia. The campaign ended in disaster, with heavy losses and eventual evacuation. Yet Gallipoli became a cornerstone of national memory in both Australia and New Zealand. Celebrated annually as Anzac Day for these dominions, the sacrifices made thousands of miles from home deepened their sense of nationhood. South Africa, newly united as a dominion in 1910, had a more complex role. Many Afrikaners, descendants of Dutch settlers, resented British rule after the brutal Boer War just a decade earlier. Still, the South African government entered the war on Britain's side, sending troops to conquer German Southwest Africa. South African soldiers also fought in East Africa and later in Europe, where they suffered devastating losses at Delville Wood during the Battle of the Somme. The war also drew heavily on Africa. British colonies across the continent provided soldiers, labourers, and resources. In East Africa, African porters carried supplies through jungles and mountains in campaigns against German colonial forces. In West Africa, Nigerian and Ghanaian troops fought to seize German territories. The human toll was staggering, with tens of thousands of African carriers dying from disease, exhaustion, and poor conditions. Their sacrifices, often overlooked, were critical to sustaining the war effort. In the Caribbean, small colonies contributed soldiers and laborers, while also sending vital resources like sugar and rum. Troops from the West Indies Regiment fought in the Middle East and Africa, though they often faced discrimination and were given hard labor duties rather than frontline roles. Still, their participation reflected the empire's ability to mobilize even its smallest territories. The Middle East became another theater where imperial troops played decisive roles. Indian soldiers fought in Mesopotamia, where Britain sought to secure oil supplies and controlled the region. The campaign was costly, marked by the humiliating surrender at Kut in 1916, when an entire British-led garrison was captured by the Ottomans. Later, under General Maude, British and Indian troops captured Baghdad. In Palestine, British forces under General Allenby, supported by Anzac cavalry, advanced against Ottoman defenses, eventually entering Jerusalem in December 1917. The empire's naval power also ensured that the war was fought globally. The Royal Navy, supported by ships from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, hunted down German raiders across the oceans. In 1914, the Australian cruiser HMAS Sydney sank the German light cruiser Emden near the Cocos Islands, a celebrated victory for the young Dominion. In Africa and the Pacific, British and Dominion forces seized German colonies, including Samoa, New Guinea, and Togoland. The war drew on imperial economies as much as manpower. India contributed over £100 million in direct funding. Canadian wheat, Australian wool, and New Zealand meat kept soldiers fed and clothed. African colonies supplied minerals and raw materials. The imperial network functioned as Britain's lifeline, providing the resources necessary to continue the war. Without the empire, Britain could not have sustained its effort against Germany. Yet the war also transformed relationships within the empire. The dominions, through their sacrifices, gained a stronger sense of independence. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand demanded greater say in imperial decision-making, culminating in their separate signatures on the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. For India, the war raised expectations of political reform. The sacrifices of Indian soldiers fueled demands for self-government, leading to the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms of 1919. In Africa and the Caribbean, veterans returned home with new perspectives, questioning the legitimacy of colonial rule. The First World War showed both the strength and the fragility of empire. It demonstrated that Britain could mobilize a quarter of the globe in a common cause. But it also revealed the strains such mobilization created. The cost in blood and treasure was immense, and the political consequences would reshape the empire in the decades that followed. By the time the war ended in November 1918, the empire had fought across continents and oceans, from the mud of Flanders to the deserts of Mesopotamia, from the cliffs of Gallipoli to the jungles of East Africa. Britain's global empire had been at war. It emerged victorious, but the sacrifices of its subjects had planted the seeds of change. The war for empire had bound its peoples closer together in the short term, but in the long term, it had set them on paths toward independence. The British Empire had fought a global war, and though it survived, it would never be the same. When the guns finally fell silent on November 11th, 1918, Britain stood among the victors. The empire had survived the greatest conflict the world had ever seen, and its flag still flew across a quarter of the globe. Yet behind the triumph lay a darker truth. The war had come at a staggering cost. The British Empire emerged, not as the unchallenged master of the world, but as a nation deeply weakened, financially drained, dependent on others, and forever altered in its global position. The economic toll was immediate and severe. Britain had spent nearly £9 billion on the war effort, a figure almost unimaginable at the time. Before the war, Britain had been the world's greatest creditor nation. Its banks and financiers in the City of London had lent money to countries across the globe, funding railways in South America, industries in the United States, and colonial projects in Africa and Asia. Sterling had been the backbone of global finance. By 1919, this picture had been reversed. Britain was no longer a creditor but a debtor. Much of this debt was owed to the United States. During the war, Britain had been forced to borrow heavily from American banks and the US government to fund its imports of food, munitions, and raw materials. By the end of the conflict, Britain owed the United States more than £850 million, a crushing sum that marked a profound shift in global financial power. For the first time in modern history, London was no longer the unrivaled center of the world economy. New York was rising in its place. The war also devastated Britain's trade position. Before 1914, Britain had dominated world trade, exporting manufactured goods and importing food and raw materials from across the empire. During the war, shipping losses to German U-boats and the diversion of industry to military production disrupted this system. By 1919, Britain's share of global trade had fallen significantly. The United States and Japan, relatively untouched by the devastation of European battlefields, had seized market share. The loss of men deepened this economic strain. Nearly 1 million British soldiers had been killed, with many more wounded. A generation of young men, the workforce of the future, had been lost. Farms lacked laborers, factories struggled to rebuild production, and entire communities carried the scars of sacrifice. War widows and disabled veterans placed new demands on the state, creating a financial burden that stretched the limits of government resources at home. The costs of maintaining the empire became increasingly difficult to bear. The war had expanded Britain's commitments. New territories had been acquired under the League of Nations mandate system, including former German colonies in Africa and Ottoman lands in the Middle East, Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. Administering these territories required money and troops, resources that Britain could scarcely afford. The financial pressure forced Britain into dependence. The special relationship with the United States began not in the Second World War, but in the aftermath of the First. American loans, investments, and markets became essential to Britain's recovery. Yet this dependence came at a price. Britain was no longer free to act entirely on its own. Its ability to dictate global financial terms had been replaced by a reliance on Washington. The empire's colonies and dominions also began to question the costs of dependence. India, which had contributed so much in manpower and money, expected political reform in return. The Montague Declaration of 1917 had promised the gradual development of self-governing institutions, but the reality after the war was slow and disappointing. The Roulette Acts of 1919, which extended wartime repressive powers, fueled resentment. The massacre at Amritsar that same year, when British troops opened fire on unarmed protesters, killing hundreds, symbolized the gap between imperial promises and reality. For many Indians, the war had shown both the sacrifices they could make and the hypocrisy of British rule. In Ireland, the costs of war and the delay of Home Rule fed nationalist anger. The Easter Rising of 1916 had already shaken the empire, and after the war, the demand for independence could no longer be contained. The Irish War of Independence began in 1919, pitting Irish Republicans against British forces in a brutal guerrilla conflict. Within 3 years, Britain would concede the establishment of the Irish Free State, a blow to imperial unity. Elsewhere, unrest simmered. In Egypt, protests erupted in 1919 against continued British control, leading to widespread violence and repression. In Africa, returning veterans demanded better treatment and questioned colonial rule. The war had raised expectations of greater equality within the empire, but these expectations were often met with disappointment. The gap between Britain's rhetoric of defending freedom and its practice of maintaining empire became increasingly stark. The financial strain also reshaped domestic politics. The post-war years saw strikes, inflation, and unemployment as the economy struggled to adjust from wartime production to peace. The cost of living soared, and many workers demanded better wages and conditions. The government's attempts to cut spending led to what became known as the Geddes Acts of 1922, slashing public services in an effort to balance the budget. These austerity measures deepened social unrest. Internationally, Britain faced a world it no longer controlled. The Washington Naval Conference of 1921–22 forced Britain to accept naval parity with the United States, abandoning the two-power standard that had once defined the Royal Navy's supremacy. Japan, too, was recognized as a rising naval power in the Pacific. The empire's ability to project dominance across the seas had been curtailed. Debt and dependence were not just economic realities, but symbols of decline. The British Empire remained vast, but its position at the center of the world had been eroded. The illusion of unshakable supremacy, so strong before 1914, had been replaced by a fragile reliance on others. The seeds of imperial unraveling had been sown. The interwar years would show just how deeply the Great War had transformed Britain's empire. Financial weakness, colonial unrest, and geopolitical competition would test its foundations. Victory in 1918 had come at a cost that Britain could never fully recover from. The empire still looked powerful on maps, but beneath the surface, it was already in debt and already in decline. The First World War had left the British Empire bloodied, indebted, and fragile. Victory had been achieved at staggering cost, but peace would prove just as testing as war. The 2 decades between 1919 and 1939, the interwar years, were years of struggle. They were years when the empire sought to recover its strength, preserve its prestige, and maintain control over its far-flung dominions and colonies. Yet they were also years when the forces of decline grew more apparent as political unrest, economic weakness, and the rise of new powers challenged Britain's global position. The peace settlement of 1919 symbolized both the empire's triumph and its burden. At Versailles, Britain emerged as one of the principal victors. It gained control of new territories under the League of Nations mandate system, former German colonies in Africa, Tanzania, Cameroon, and Togoland, and former Ottoman territories in the Middle East, including Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. These acquisitions expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent in history. On maps, the red of British possessions spread wider than ever before. But the reality of governing these new lands strained Britain's already overextended resources. Administering Iraq, for example, proved costly and contentious. Britain faced revolts in 1920 when local populations resisted foreign control. Maintaining order required extensive military deployment and aerial bombardment. In Palestine, tensions grew between Arab and Jewish communities, with Britain caught between conflicting promises made during the war. These new territories, far from strengthening the empire, became sources of unrest and financial drain. At home, the empire grappled with its weakened economy. Britain had lost its position as the world's financial leader to the United States. The 1920s saw repeated economic crises, inflation, high unemployment, and declining exports. The coal industry, once the backbone of British power, faced competition from cheaper foreign coal and from oil. In 1926, the general strike brought the nation to a halt as workers across industries walked out in solidarity with striking miners. The strike highlighted the fragility of Britain's industrial base and the growing discontent among its working class. The empire's dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa also shifted during the interwar years. Having sacrificed so much in the First World War, they demanded greater autonomy. The Imperial Conference of 1926 issued the Balfour Declaration, not to be confused with the 1917 Declaration on Palestine, which recognized the dominions as autonomous communities within the British Empire, equal in status. This principle was enshrined in the Statute of Westminster in 1931, giving dominions full legislative independence. While they remained loyal to Britain, the dominions were no longer subordinates. The empire had begun to transform into a looser commonwealth. In India, the push for independence accelerated. The Amritsar massacre of 1919, when British troops killed hundreds of unarmed protesters, shocked global opinion and radicalized Indian politics. Mohandas Gandhi emerged as the leader of mass movements of non-violent resistance, calling for boycotts of British goods, refusal to pay taxes, and civil disobedience. The 1920s and 1930s saw waves of protests, strikes, and imprisonment of nationalist leaders. Britain responded with both concessions and repression. Limited reforms, such as the Government of India Act of 1935, offered self-governance to provinces. But ultimate power remained with the colonial administration. The demand for full independence could no longer be ignored. Ireland presented another challenge. After the Irish War of Independence, the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 created the Irish Free State, a self-governing dominion within the empire. But partition left 6 counties in Ulster as Northern Ireland, remaining part of the United Kingdom. This division sparked deep political and sectarian conflict that would continue for decades. For Britain, the loss of most of Ireland marked the first major contraction of its empire in modern times. Across the wider empire, nationalist sentiments stirred. In Egypt, protests in 1919 led Britain to declare it independent in 1922, though it retained control of the Suez Canal and defense. In Africa and the Caribbean, returning veterans of the First World War demanded better treatment and political rights. Though full independence was still distant, the seeds of decolonization were taking root. The interwar years were not only defined by political unrest, but also by the Great Depression. The Wall Street crash of 1929 triggered a global economic crisis. For Britain, the Depression brought mass unemployment, with shipyards, factories, and coal mines closing across the industrial heartlands. The empire became both a burden and a lifeline. Imperial preference policies, introduced in 1932, sought to strengthen trade within the empire by imposing tariffs on outside goods, while this system tied Britain closer to its dominions and colonies. It also revealed its dependence on them for economic survival internationally. The rise of new powers cast long shadows over Britain's position. The United States had emerged as the world's economic and financial leader. Japan expanded aggressively in Asia, invading Manchuria in 1931 and threatening British interests in China. Germany, under Adolf Hitler after 1933, rearmed and defied the Treaty of Versailles. The balance of power that had sustained Britain's global role after 1918 was collapsing. Britain's response was cautious, haunted by the horrors of the First World War. Many leaders pursued appeasement, hoping to avoid another catastrophic conflict. The empire was unprepared for a Second World War. Its armed forces were underfunded, its economy strained, and its people weary. Yet the reality of rising threats made confrontation inevitable. By the late 1930s, Britain found itself at a crossroads. The empire still looked vast on maps, and ceremonies such as the Silver Jubilee of George V in 1935 projected confidence. But beneath the surface, its power was hollowing out. Economic weakness, growing independence among dominions, nationalist movements in colonies, and the challenge of rising powers abroad all pointed to a fragile future. The interwar struggle revealed a fundamental truth. The First World War had changed everything. Britain had survived, but not unscathed. The empire was no longer secure, no longer invincible, and no longer capable of ruling the world without challenge. The shadows of decline had deepened, even as another, even greater storm gathered on the horizon. The Great War had ended in 1918 with the promise of lasting peace. But the interwar years revealed that peace was fragile, uncertain, and ultimately unsustainable. For the British Empire, the 2 decades between the world wars were a time of uneasy recovery, growing unrest, and looming danger. By the mid-1930s, it was clear that the world was sliding once again toward conflict, a conflict Britain could not avoid, yet was scarcely prepared to fight. The seeds of this new war lay in the failures of the peace settlement at Versailles. Germany had been forced to accept responsibility for the war, stripped of territory and burdened with reparations. But instead of securing peace, these measures fueled resentment and economic hardship. In the 1920s, the fragile Weimar Republic struggled to stabilize the country. By the early 1930s, amid the global Great Depression, Germans turned to a radical alternative: Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Hitler's rise to power in 1933 marked a turning point for Europe and for Britain. Almost immediately, Germany began to defy the post-war order. Hitler withdrew from the League of Nations, rebuilt the military, and revived nationalist ambitions. The reoccupation of the Rhineland in 1936, in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, was a bold gamble. Britain and France protested but did not intervene. For Britain, still scarred by the memory of the trenches and weakened by economic struggles, the prospect of another war was deeply unpopular. Appeasement, the policy of making concessions to maintain peace, became the guiding principle of British foreign policy. The empire's leaders hoped to buy time. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who took office in 1937, believed that war could be avoided through negotiation. The Munich Agreement of 1938 seemed to confirm this hope. By conceding the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia, to Hitler, Chamberlain declared that Britain had secured peace for our time. Yet beneath the relief lay unease. Many suspected that appeasement had merely postponed the inevitable, while Europe moved toward crisis. Threats to Britain's empire grew elsewhere. In Asia, Japan had invaded Manchuria in 1931 and launched full-scale war against China in 1937. Japanese expansion threatened British possessions in Hong Kong, Malaya, and Singapore, as well as vital trade routes through the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Britain's ability to defend these territories was limited, as much of its attention remained fixed on Europe. At the same time, the empire's internal stability continued to erode. In India, the independence movement gained momentum. Gandhi launched new campaigns of non-violent resistance, while younger leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru pushed for complete self. The British response alternated between repression and limited reform, but the demand for freedom grew stronger with each passing year. In Palestine, Britain struggled to manage rising tensions between Jewish immigrants and Arab residents, while in Africa, nationalist voices began to stir. The empire looked strong on maps, but its foundations were restless. Domestically, Britain faced deep challenges. The Great Depression had devastated industries and communities, leaving unemployment high in the 1930s, though rearmament began slowly in response to Germany's provocations. Many believed the government was not moving quickly enough. The Royal Air Force expanded its fighter command, and new radar systems were developed, but Britain remained vulnerable. The Royal Navy, once unchallenged, now faced growing competition from Germany, Italy, and Japan. The army, small by continental standards, lacked modern equipment. As the crisis deepened, alliances shifted. Britain sought to strengthen ties with France, though memories of World War I made cooperation uneasy. The Soviet Union, initially seen as a potential partner against Hitler, remained isolated after years of ideological hostility. In 1939, the shocking Nazi-Soviet pact shattered illusions of collective security, clearing the way for German aggression. The final step toward war came with Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939. Hitler's armies struck with unprecedented speed, overwhelming Polish defenses. 2 days later, on September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Once again, the British Empire found itself drawn into a global conflict. The war Britain had sought to avoid had arrived, and this time the stakes would be even higher for the empire. The declaration of war was not confined to Britain alone. As in 1914, the dominions and colonies rallied to the cause. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa all entered the war in support of Britain, though increasingly on their own terms as autonomous nations. India, still under colonial rule, contributed soldiers and resources. The empire would once again fight across continents and oceans. Yet, Britain entered this Second World War under far weaker conditions than in 1914. The empire was vast, but its resources were stretched thin. Debt from the First World War remained heavy, and the global economy was still fragile. Public morale was uncertain, haunted by the trauma of the last war. The British government knew that survival would require not only military strength, but also the full mobilization of the empire's resources, as 1939 gave way to 1940. The reality of Britain's struggle became clear. Germany swept through Poland, then turned west, conquering Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands. France, Britain's key ally, fell in June 1940. The British Expeditionary Force was forced into a desperate evacuation at Dunkirk, leaving much of its equipment behind. Britain now stood alone in Western Europe against Hitler's war machine. The empire loomed as both a strength and a vulnerability. Its resources, manpower, food, oil, and raw materials offered a lifeline. But its far-flung territories, from Singapore to Egypt, became targets for enemy powers. The Second World War would not only test Britain's survival as a nation, but also the survival of the empire itself. The looming conflict cast a long shadow. In London, the streets were darkened in preparation for air raids. Across the dominions, young men enlisted, preparing to sail once more for battlefields thousands of miles away. In India, the independence movement prepared to seize upon the war as an opportunity to demand greater freedom. In Asia, Japanese expansion threatened the empire's prestige. The storm that had gathered in the interwar years had finally broken. The Second World War loomed not as a distant danger, but as an immediate reality. Britain faced a war greater than any in its history, one that would determine not just the fate of Europe, but the future of the empire itself. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone. France had fallen to Hitler's armies, and Nazi forces now dominated continental Europe. Across the Channel, German troops prepared for the next phase of conquest, the invasion of Britain itself. For the empire that once ruled a quarter of the globe, the situation was dire. Survival was no longer guaranteed. The coming months would test Britain's endurance, its people, and the very foundations of the empire. The immediate threat was invasion. Hitler's Operation Sea Lion called for the crossing of the English Channel and the defeat of British defences. But before troops could land, the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, had to secure control of the skies. Thus began the Battle of Britain, the first major campaign fought entirely in the air. From July to October 1940, the skies above southern England filled with combat. The Luftwaffe unleashed wave after wave of bombers and fighters, targeting airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. The Royal Air Force, vastly outnumbered, relied on skill, new technology, and sheer determination. Britain's development of radar, still a relatively new invention, gave its pilots early warning of incoming raids. The Dowding system, named after Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, coordinated fighter responses with remarkable efficiency. Young men from across Britain and from across the Empire flew, Spitfires and Hurricanes, in desperate defense. Pilots from Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa joined the fight. Volunteers from occupied Europe, including Poland and Czechoslovakia, also served. The RAF's resistance became legendary, immortalized in Winston Churchill's declaration. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. By October, the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. Britain had survived the first test, but survival came at a heavy price. In September 1940, frustrated by the RAF's resilience, Hitler shifted tactics. Instead of focusing solely on military targets, the Luftwaffe began bombing British cities. The Blitz, a campaign of sustained aerial bombardment, plunged civilians into the front line of war. London became the primary target, struck night after night. Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, and other industrial centres also suffered devastating raids. For civilians, the experience was harrowing. Night after night, Families crowded into air raid shelters, underground stations, and makeshift bunkers. The wail of sirens, the thunder of bombs, and the collapse of buildings became part of daily life. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Fires lit the night sky as incendiary bombs rained down. In London alone, tens of thousands were killed. Across Britain, nearly 43,000 civilians would lose their lives in the Blitz, yet the bombings failed to break Britain's will. Civilians adapted, showing remarkable resilience. Public morale, though shaken, did not collapse. Newspapers, cinema reels, and government propaganda reinforced a narrative of endurance and unity. Keep calm and carry on became more than a slogan. It was a necessity. The monarchy played its part, with King George VI and Queen Elizabeth visiting bombed-out areas, projecting solidarity with the people. Churchill's leadership was central to Britain's survival. Becoming Prime Minister in May 1940, just as France collapsed, he rallied the nation with speeches that combined honesty about the dangers with defiance against surrender. His words, "We shall fight on the beaches and their finest hour," framed the struggle as not merely for Britain, but for civilization itself. The war was cast as a moral battle, one in which Britain stood as the last bastion of freedom against tyranny. The Empire, too, played a critical role. Resources flowed from colonies and dominions to sustain Britain. Canada increased food exports. Australia and New Zealand provided meat and wool. India supplied troops and materials, and African colonies contributed minerals essential for munitions. The global reach of the empire ensured that Britain could continue the fight even as its homeland was under siege. But the war was not confined to the skies above Britain. Across the seas, the Battle of the Atlantic raged. German U-boats sought to cut off Britain's lifeline of supplies. Merchant ships carrying food, fuel, and weapons from the Empire and the United States were hunted relentlessly. Convoys, escorted by Royal Navy warships, became vital. Losses were severe, but without this lifeline, Britain could not endure. By 1941, advances in sonar, air patrols, and code-breaking at Bletchley Park began to tilt the battle in Britain's favour. The Blitz eventually eased in May 1941, as Hitler turned his attention to the Soviet Union, but the damage was immense. Thousands of homes had been destroyed, industries disrupted, and cities scarred. Yet Britain had survived its darkest hour. Against the odds, the nation and its empire had stood firm, denying Hitler his first major defeat. The battle for survival, however, was far from over. The war had widened into a truly global conflict. In North Africa, British and Commonwealth forces clashed with Italian and later German troops under General Erwin Rommel. In the Middle East, Britain defended vital oil supplies and the Suez Canal. In Asia, Japan loomed as an ever-growing threat. The empire was fighting not just for Britain's survival, but for its very existence as a global power. The experience of the Blitz left lasting legacies. It showed that modern war was no longer confined to battlefields. Civilians were now targets. It demonstrated the importance of air power, technology, and intelligence, and it revealed the resilience of a people and an empire under siege. For Britain, the Battle of Britain and the Blitz marked a turning point. The empire had endured its gravest threat since Napoleon more than a century earlier. Its survival ensured that the fight against Nazi Germany would continue. Yet the cost was high, in lives lost, in cities destroyed, and in the realization that the war ahead would be long and brutal. The Blitz had been a battle not just of bombs and fire, but of morale, endurance, and survival. And though Britain had endured, the struggle of the empire was only beginning. The next phase of war would stretch its resources further, test its colonies more deeply, and reveal the growing shadow of another power, the United States, rising to dominate the global stage. When the Second World War began in September 1939, the British Empire once again mobilized its vast resources, from India to Canada, from Africa to Australia and New Zealand. Millions of men and women prepared to serve in another global conflict. But unlike the First World War, when Britain had entered as a dominant power, this time the empire was weaker, more vulnerable, and facing enemies who would strike at its most prized possessions. The declaration of war instantly reverberated across the dominions and colonies. Canada declared war within a week. Australia and New Zealand followed almost immediately, and South Africa joined as well, despite internal divisions. In India, still under British rule, more than 2.5 million soldiers would eventually volunteer, making it the largest volunteer army in history. African colonies contributed soldiers, carriers, and laborers, while the Caribbean and Pacific Islands supplied manpower and resources. These contributions were vital. Britain's homeland, still recovering from the economic toll of the First World War and the Great Depression, could not fight alone. Troops from India fought in North Africa and the Middle East. Canadians landed in Hong Kong and later stormed the beaches of Normandy. Australians and New Zealanders would fight across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The empire once again became Britain's lifeline in a global struggle. Yet the war of 1939 to 1945 was different. This time, the empire itself became the battlefield, as enemy forces struck directly at its territories. In December 1941, everything changed. Japan, already at war in China, launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, drawing the United States into the conflict. Simultaneously, Japanese forces struck British and Dutch colonies across Southeast Asia. Within weeks, Hong Kong had fallen. Then came the greatest humiliation, the loss of Singapore. Singapore had been called the Gibraltar of the East, a fortress that was supposed to safeguard Britain's empire in Asia. It was believed to be impregnable, protected by heavy coastal guns, a strong garrison, and its strategic location commanding the Straits of Malacca. But in February 1942, after a rapid Japanese advance through Malaya, Singapore fell. More than 80,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops were taken prisoner. The collapse stunned the world. Winston Churchill himself called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The fall of Singapore shattered the illusion of British invincibility. For decades, colonial subjects had been told that Britain's empire was unassailable, protected by its navy and its armies. Now, an Asian power had humiliated Britain, destroying the myth of racial and military superiority that underpinned imperial rule. The impact of Singapore's loss was profound. Across Asia, it emboldened nationalist movements. In India, leaders of the independence movement saw Britain's weakness as proof that its rule could not last. In Burma, nationalist groups collaborated with Japanese forces, hoping for liberation from colonial rule. In Malaya and Indonesia, Japan's victories undermined European dominance and inspired local resistance movements that would later push for independence. For the soldiers captured at Singapore and elsewhere, the consequences were brutal. Prisoners of war endured horrific conditions in Japanese camps, forced into slave labor on projects such as the Burma Railway. Tens of thousands died of starvation, disease, and mistreatment. The suffering of these men became emblematic of the empire's failure to protect its own. Even as Britain reeled from defeats in Asia, colonial soldiers fought with courage and distinction across multiple theaters. Over 2.5 million Indians served, fighting in North Africa, in Italy, and in the jungles of Burma. Hundreds of thousands of Africans from Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, and other territories fought in East Africa against Italian forces. In North Africa, alongside British armies, and later in Burma, more than 1 million Canadians served, from the defense of Hong Kong to the Normandy landings. Australians and New Zealanders endured heavy losses in Greece, Crete, and North Africa, and later fought in the Pacific as Japanese bombs fell on Darwin and fears of invasion spread. These contributions highlighted both the strength and fragility of empire. Britain could still call upon vast resources, but each sacrifice deepened the colonies' demand for recognition, equality, and eventually independence. Japan's rapid conquests marked a turning point in global history. Never before had an Asian power defeated European empires so decisively. The fall of Singapore, the occupation of Malaya, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies, and the capture of Hong Kong revealed the vulnerability of colonial rule. Though Japan's empire would itself collapse by 1945, the psychological blow to European prestige could not be undone. For Britain, regaining these territories after the war did not restore the old order. The myth of invincibility had been broken. Nationalist movements that had grown during the Japanese occupation would not be silenced when Britain returned. The war in Asia was not just about defeating Japan. It was about the beginning of the end for European empires. Despite the humiliations, the empire continued to fight. Britain, with American support, launched counteroffensives. In Burma, the Chindits, long-range British and Indian units, carried out raids deep behind Japanese lines. In 1944-45, British, Indian, and African troops fought grueling battles at Impol and Kohima, halting Japan's advance into India and turning the tide in Southeast Asia. But victory came at immense cost. The empire had been drained financially, militarily, and psychologically. The war in Asia had revealed the fragility of Britain's global system. Even as Britain celebrated victory in 1945, it was clear that its empire had been fatally weakened. The Second World War was not just a military struggle. It was also a test of legitimacy. The empire depended on the belief that Britain could protect its colonies, defend its people, and guarantee stability. Japan's victories shattered that belief. Colonial subjects had seen that Britain could be defeated. They had fought, bled, and died for an empire that could no longer guarantee its own supremacy. For Britain, the war in Asia was a sobering reminder of decline. The empire was at war again, but this time it was fighting not just for survival against external enemies, but against the erosion of its own authority. By the early 1940s, the British Empire was still fighting for survival, but the balance of global power had already begun to shift. For centuries, Britain had been the world's financial center, its navy the guarantor of global trade, its empire the source of unmatched wealth and manpower. Yet the Second World War revealed a stark reality. Britain could no longer wage global war on its own. The strain of 2 world wars in a single generation was too much. Into this vacuum stepped a new power, the United States of America. By the end of the Second World War, America's dominance was unquestionable, and Britain's empire would never again be the world's center of power. The seeds of this transition had been planted during the First World War. By 1918, Britain had already become heavily indebted to the United States. Loans and supplies from across the Atlantic had helped Britain fight, but at the cost of its financial supremacy. After the war, Britain remained the world's largest empire, but New York began to eclipse London as the global financial hub. The Second World War would complete this shift. When the war began in 1939, the United States remained officially neutral. Yet from the outset, Britain relied on American industry. The Neutrality Acts restricted US involvement, but by 1940, as Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration sought ways to provide aid. The cash and carry system allowed Britain to purchase American goods if they paid up front and transported them themselves. Soon, however, Britain's reserves were exhausted. In December 1940, Churchill wrote to Roosevelt, admitting that Britain was nearly bankrupt. Without American support, the empire could not continue the fight. The response was the Lend-Lease Act of March 1941. This groundbreaking policy allowed the United States to supply Britain with weapons, ships, aircraft, and raw materials without immediate payment. Instead, repayment would come later in kind or through shared defense. Roosevelt described it as lending a neighbor a garden hose to put out a fire, rather than selling it outright. For Britain, Lend-Lease was salvation. Tens of thousands of trucks, tanks, and aircraft flowed across the Atlantic. Merchant convoys carried American wheat, oil, and machinery to British ports. The empire's survival now depended on American industry. The symbolic importance of Lend-Lease was as great as the material aid. It marked the moment when global leadership shifted. Britain, once the lender and guarantor of others, was now the debtor. America had become the arsenal of democracy, a phrase Roosevelt used, described the nation's role in arming not just Britain, but all Allied forces after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The United States entered the war fully. The conflict was now truly global, and Britain was no longer the senior partner. The scale of America's contribution was overwhelming. By 1944, the United States was producing nearly half of the world's manufactured goods. Its shipyards launched Liberty ships faster than German U-boats could sink them. Its aircraft factories turned out thousands of bombers and fighters every month. Its armed forces grew into the largest in history, deployed simultaneously in Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. Britain remained a vital ally, but its role had shifted. The empire provided bases, manpower, and experience, but America provided the resources that would win the war. Joint operations like the invasion of North Africa in 1942, the invasion of Italy in 1943, and ultimately D-Day in 1944 reflected this partnership. Yet increasingly, it was Washington, not London, that dictated grand strategy. The relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt symbolized this new balance. Churchill worked tirelessly to maintain Britain's influence, traveling across the Atlantic repeatedly to meet Roosevelt and secure commitments. Their personal bond was genuine, built on mutual respect and shared vision. Yet the reality was clear. Roosevelt led the stronger partner. American demands often prevailed. Whether in prioritizing the Pacific Theater after Pearl Harbor or in pressing for the timing of the D-80 invasion, the shift in power was also evident in diplomacy. The Atlantic Charter of August 1941, drafted by Roosevelt and Churchill, laid out the principles of the post-war world. It called for self-determination of peoples, free trade, and collective security. For colonized nations under British rule, these words carried enormous weight. Indian nationalists, for example, pointed to the Charter as evidence that Britain could not continue to deny independence. The ideals of Roosevelt's America clashed with the realities of Churchill's empire. Economically, Britain's dependence deepened. Lend-Lease was only part of the story. Britain sold off overseas assets to pay for imports, liquidating investments that had once underpinned its financial dominance. Gold reserves dwindled, foreign holdings were lost, and debts mounted. By the end of the war, Britain owed the United States over £3 billion, a debt so vast that it would take decades to repay. The empire that had financed others in the 19th century now lived on borrowed American credit. Militarily, the imbalance grew obvious. American forces dwarfed British ones, particularly after 1942. The massive build-up of US troops in Britain before D-Day made clear who held the decisive weight. In the Pacific, Britain played only a supporting role, as the United States led the campaign against Japan. Even in Europe, where Britain remained a key ally, American manpower, resources, and leadership drove the final push against Nazi Germany for Britain's empire. America's ascendancy carried profound consequences. Colonies and dominions observed the new reality. Canada, with its close economic ties to the United States, increasingly looked south rather than across the Atlantic. In Asia, nationalist leaders understood that the age of European dominance was waning. Roosevelt himself was skeptical of colonial empires, pressing Churchill privately on issues of decolonization. While Churchill resisted fiercely, the tide of history had turned. By 1945, the war was nearing its end. In Europe, Allied forces closed in on Berlin, while in the Pacific, American victories at Iwo Jima and Okinawa brought Japan to the brink. The atomic bomb, developed by the United States, symbolized the ultimate demonstration of America's technological and military superiority. Britain had contributed to the research, but it was America that built and used the weapon. When victory came, Britain remained a respected power, but it was no longer the world's leader. The United States emerged from the war stronger than ever, economically dominant, militarily unmatched, and politically central to the creation of a new world order. The United Nations, established in 1945, reflected American leadership. The Bretton Woods system, which created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, centered on the US dollar, not the British pound. For the British Empire, America's ascendance marked both survival and decline. Without American aid, Britain might not have survived the war at all. Yet survival came at the cost of independence and supremacy. The empire was now overshadowed by its former colony. Britain's role had shifted from global hegemon to junior partner in a new transatlantic alliance. The consequences were far-reaching. Britain would still wield influence, but never again on the scale of the 19th century. The world had entered the American century. For the British Empire, the Second World War had not only been a struggle for survival, but also the moment it ceded leadership to another power. By the end of the Second World War, the jewel in the crown of the British Empire was slipping from Britain's grasp. India, the empire's most prized possession, had provided enormous contributions during both world wars. More than 2.5 million Indians served in uniform during the Second World War, the largest volunteer army in history. They fought in North Africa, Europe, and Asia, alongside British and Allied forces. But their sacrifices deepened an old question. How long could Britain rule India without granting it the independence its people demanded? The Indian independence movement had grown steadily between the wars. The Amritsar massacre of 1919, when British troops fired on unarmed protesters, killing hundreds, marked a turning point. Gandhi's campaigns of non-violent resistance throughout the 1920s and 1930s brought millions into the struggle. The Salt March of 1930, a 240-mile protest against the salt tax, demonstrated the power of peaceful defiance. By the late 1930s, the Indian National Congress, led by Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, stood as the dominant political force in the country. When war broke out in 1939, Britain declared India at war without consulting Indian leaders. This decision ignited fury. Congress demanded immediate independence in exchange for cooperation. When Britain refused, Congress leaders resigned from provincial governments. Gandhi launched the Quit India movement in 1942, calling for Britain to leave India at once. The British response was swift. Thousands of leaders, including Gandhi, were arrested. Yet the demand for independence could not be silenced. Meanwhile, divisions between Hindus and Muslims deepened. The All India Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, argued that Muslims required their own state, separate from Hindu-majority India. By 1940, the Lahore Resolution formally called for the creation of Pakistan. As the war dragged on, the prospect of partition loomed larger. The Second World War intensified the crisis. India became a crucial base for the Allied campaign in Asia. Indian soldiers fought in Burma against Japanese forces, enduring brutal jungle warfare. The war effort also strained the Indian economy, leading to shortages and famine. The Bengal famine of 1943, in which millions died, exposed both colonial neglect and the fragility of British rule. By 1945, Britain was exhausted. Victory had been achieved, but the empire was financially bankrupt. Maintaining control over India, with its mass protests, communal tensions, and growing violence, seemed impossible. In 1946, mutinies in the Royal Indian Navy revealed the discontent even within the armed forces. That same year, elections showed overwhelming support for independence, with Congress and the Muslim League both demanding change. Though with competing visions, in 1947, faced with mounting unrest and the impossibility of continued rule, Britain conceded. Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, oversaw the transfer of power. On August 15, 1947, India became independent and partition created Pakistan. The moment was historic but tragic. Independence came with violence, as Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs were divided by hastily drawn borders. Millions were displaced in one of the largest migrations in human history, and hundreds of thousands were killed in communal violence. For Britain, the loss of India was a seismic moment. It marked the end of the empire's core. The jewel in the crown was gone, and with it, the illusion that Britain could maintain global dominance. India's independence was both a triumph for its people and a symbol of the irreversible decline of the British Empire. The loss of India in 1947 was more than the independence of a single colony. It was the signal that the age of empire was ending. Within 2 decades, Britain's global dominion would unravel at a pace few could have imagined. Across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, nationalist movements surged, colonial rule collapsed, and Britain's empire gave way to a commonwealth of newly independent nations. The post-war world was defined by 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Both opposed traditional empires, though for different reasons. America promoted self-determination, at least in rhetoric, and wanted access to global markets free of colonial restrictions. The Soviet Union denounced imperialism as capitalist exploitation and supported revolutionary movements worldwide. Britain found itself caught between these giants, struggling to justify an empire that seemed increasingly outdated. The Middle East was among the first flashpoints. Britain had controlled Palestine since 1917 under a League of Nations mandate. By the 1940s, tensions between Jews and Arabs had erupted into violence. Jewish immigration, driven by the Holocaust, intensified conflict. Britain, unable to contain the violence, handed the issue to the newly formed United Nations. In 1948, the State of Israel was created, and British troops withdrew. Palestine symbolized Britain's diminishing ability to manage global crises in Africa. Nationalist movements gained strength. Ghana, under the leadership of Kwame, became the first sub-Saharan African colony to achieve independence in 1957. Its example inspired others. Nigeria in 1960. Kenya in 1963 after a bloody struggle against British settlers, and dozens more throughout the decade. The Momo uprising in Kenya exposed the brutality of colonial rule and the limits of British power. By the mid-1960s, most of Britain's African empire had gained independence. In Asia, Burma gained independence in 1948, followed by Ceylon, Sri Lanka in the same year, and Malaya in 1957. The retreat from empire in Asia was rapid, driven by both nationalist resistance and Britain's inability to sustain military commitments. The loss of India had shown that colonial rule was unsustainable. The rest of Asia followed. The Caribbean and Pacific would follow later, with gradual independence through the 1960s and 1970s. Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados became independent in the early 1960s. Even tiny Pacific territories eventually achieved sovereignty. The process of decolonization was not uniform. Some transitions were peaceful, achieved through negotiation. Others were violent, marked by guerrilla wars, repression, and bloodshed. But the direction was unmistakable. The empire was dissolving before the world's eyes. For Britain itself, decolonization was both an adjustment and an identity crisis. Politically, it sought to transform empire into commonwealth, a voluntary association of independent nations, tied by shared history and often by the English language. Economically, Britain faced decline. The empire had once been the foundation of its wealth, but now it struggled with debt, loss of markets, and industrial decline at home. Psychologically, the loss of empire forced Britain to redefine its place in the world, no longer ruler of a global system, but a medium power in a bipolar order dominated by Washington and Moscow. By the 1950s, one moment revealed the true extent of Britain's diminished power: the Suez Crisis of 1956, when Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Britain, alongside France and Israel, launched a military intervention. Militarily, the operation succeeded. Politically, it was a disaster. The United States, fearing Cold War escalation, forced Britain and France to withdraw. The crisis exposed Britain's inability to act independently of American approval. Suez was, in the eyes of many, the final humiliation, the moment when Britain's imperial pretensions were laid to rest. By the 1960s, the empire that had once covered a quarter of the globe was gone. What remained was a commonwealth of nations, a reminder of shared history, but also a testament to the end of British rule. The the speed of this transformation was breathtaking. In 1945, Britain had still governed vast territories across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. By 1970, nearly all were independent. Decolonization was not only the story of Britain's loss, but also the story of new nations finding their place in the world. Leaders like Nkrumah in Ghana, Nehru in India, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, and others shaped the future of their countries, often under difficult circumstances. The legacy of empire economic structures, ethnic divisions, and political systems remained, for better and worse. But one truth was clear. The British Empire was no more. For centuries, Britain had believed that its empire was eternal, but the years after 1947 showed otherwise. The winds of change had become a storm, sweeping away centuries of imperial rule. Britain would remain influential, but never again would it dominate the world. By the mid-1950s, Britain was no longer the empire it had once been. India was gone, much of Asia was slipping away, and Africa was in the throes of nationalist awakening. Yet Britain still clung to the belief that it remained a world power. Its leaders continued to act as though the empire's prestige and authority endured, even as its economic and military foundations crumbled. The illusion would collapse in 1956, in an episode that came to symbolize the final humiliation of the British Empire, the Suez Crisis, the Suez Canal. Completed in 1869, was one of the most important strategic waterways in the world. It connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, providing a direct route between Europe and Asia for Britain. The canal was the lifeline of empire, the route to India, the Far East, and beyond. Even after India's independence, the canal remained vital for Britain's oil imports from the Middle East. Control of Suez was synonymous with Britain's global reach. After the Second World War, Egypt sought to reclaim control of its own destiny. Nationalism was on the rise, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, who came to power in 1952 after a coup that overthrew the monarchy. Charismatic, ambitious, and determined to free Egypt from Western dominance, Nasser soon became a symbol of Arab independence. His policies challenged Britain's lingering influence in the Middle East. In July 1956, Nasser delivered his boldest move, the nationalization of the Suez Canal, to Egyptians. It was a triumphant act of sovereignty. To Britain and France, it was an intolerable threat to their economic interests and global prestige. Prime Minister Anthony Eden, already struggling to maintain Britain's image as a great power, viewed Nasser as a dictator who had to be removed. Behind closed doors, Britain and France conspired with Israel to launch a military intervention. The plan was simple. Israel would invade Egypt across the Sinai Peninsula, giving Britain and France a pretext to intervene under the guise of separating the combatants and protecting the canal. In reality, the aim was to overthrow Nasser and reassert Western control. On October 29, 1956, Israel attacked. British and French forces soon followed, launching airstrikes and paratroop assaults. Militarily, the operation achieved its goals. Egyptian forces were overwhelmed, and the canal was quickly seized. Yet, the apparent victory collapsed almost immediately under international pressure. The United States, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, was furious. Washington had not been consulted and opposed the use of force, fearing it would drive Arab nations toward the Soviet Union in the midst of the Cold War. The Soviet Union itself threatened intervention, raising the stakes of global confrontation. Under immense pressure, including financial threats from the United States. Britain and France were forced to withdraw. The humiliation was total. Britain, once the master of global empire, had been reduced to acting without American approval and quickly discovering it could not defy Washington's will. Eden, his health broken and his reputation destroyed, resigned soon after. The Suez Crisis revealed to the world what had long been clear to insiders. Britain was no longer a superpower. For the empire, Suez was the symbolic end. Even though many colonies remained in Africa and the Caribbean, the idea of Britain as a global arbiter of power was shattered. The illusion of independence in foreign policy had collapsed. From this point onward, Britain's role in the world would be tied to the United States. Suez also accelerated decolonization. Nationalists across Africa and Asia saw the crisis as proof that the age of European dominance was over. Within a decade, most of Britain's remaining colonies would gain independence. The empire that had spanned the globe was now dissolving at breakneck speed. The Suez Crisis was not just a military or political defeat. It was a moment of psychological reckoning, the moment Britain realized that the empire was gone and that its place in the world had changed forever. By the 1960s, the British Empire no longer existed in the form it once had. One by one, colonies across Africa, the Caribbean, Asia, and the Pacific achieved independence. The Union Jack was lowered, new national flags were raised, and Britain retreated into the role of a medium power. Yet the empire did not vanish entirely. Its legacy, cultural, economic, political, and emotional, remained. The ghosts of empire lingered, shaping Britain and its former colonies long after the imperial age had ended. The first and most visible ghost was migration. As colonies gained independence, many of their citizens moved to Britain, drawn by labor shortages in the post-war years and by promises of opportunity. The Windrush generation, named after the ship Empire Windrush that arrived in 1948 carrying Caribbean migrants, symbolized this new connection. Thousands came from Jamaica, Trinidad, India, Pakistan, and Africa, settling in British cities. They brought their cultures, traditions, and languages, transforming Britain into a diverse, multicultural society. Yet their arrival also exposed tensions, as racism and xenophobia clashed with the realities of a changing nation. Economically, the empire's ghost was felt through trade and finance. The Commonwealth, established as a loose association of former colonies, maintained ties of commerce and cooperation. British companies retained influence in many newly independent states, while former colonies continued to export raw materials to Britain. The pound sterling, though weakened, remained significant in global trade. But the old imperial system of guaranteed markets and control was gone. Britain increasingly looked to Europe, culminating in its entry into the European Economic Community in 1973, a sign that its future lay closer to home than across the old empire. Politically, the legacy of empire was complex. In some countries, British institutions, parliamentary democracy, common law, civil service systems, became the foundation of independent states. In others, the legacies of colonial rule were more divisive, leaving behind borders drawn without regard to ethnic or cultural realities, contributing to conflict. The partition of India, the division of Africa, and the disputes in the Middle East all bore the imprint of empire. For Britain itself, the loss of empire created an identity crisis. For centuries, its global dominance had defined its sense of self. The end of empire forced Britain to ask, What is our role in the world? Politicians spoke of a special relationship with the United States, but Britain was now the junior partner. Others argued that Britain's place was in Europe, though this would remain contested for decades. The debate over identity, imperial past, Atlantic partnership, or European future became one of the defining themes of post-imperial Britain. Culturally, the empire lived on in language, literature, and memory. English became the global lingua franca, spoken in former colonies and beyond. Writers from across the Commonwealth, from Salman Rushdie to Chinua Achebe, explored the legacies of colonialism in their works, shaping world literature. Museums in London displayed treasures from across the empire, raising debates about heritage, ownership, and restitution. Even food, curry jerk, chicken, African spices, became part of British daily life, blending cultures into something new. But the empire's ghosts were not only positive. They included scars of exploitation, slavery, and violence. The memory of concentration camps in the Boer War, the suppression of the Momo in Kenya, and the brutality of colonial wars remained. In former colonies, the economic systems created by empire often left nations dependent and unequal. In Britain, nostalgia for empire lingered, sometimes obscuring the darker realities of imperial rule. The Commonwealth itself embodied both the continuity and the contradictions of empire's legacy. It provided a framework for cooperation and dialogue, symbolized by the shared presence of the British monarch. Yet its members were independent, no longer bound by colonial ties. For some, it was a meaningful connection. For others, it was little more than a symbolic reminder of the past. By the end of the 20th century, the British Empire existed only as memory and influence. But those memories shaped politics, culture, and identity in profound ways. The ghosts of empire haunted debates about immigration, race, and Britain's place in the world. They lingered in the pride of past achievements and the shame of past abuses. They shaped how Britain saw itself and how the world saw Britain. The empire was gone, but its echoes remained, powerful and persistent. The greatest empire in history had vanished, but its ghosts lived on. The story of the British Empire is one of extraordinary rise, staggering reach, and inevitable decline. At its height, the empire was the largest in human history, a global system spanning continents, ruling hundreds of millions of people, and shaping the modern world in profound ways. It commanded oceans, dictated global trade, and projected its culture and language across the planet. For centuries, it seemed unassailable. Yet in the span of just a few decades, it collapsed. Its fall, accelerated by 2 world wars, remains one of the most dramatic transformations in world history by the mid-20th century. Britain had been reduced from the unchallenged superpower of the Victorian age to a nation, wrestling with its place in a world now dominated by others. The story of this decline is not only about battles and treaties, but about the fragility of power itself, about how even the greatest empires, no matter how vast or mighty, are subject to the forces of change. The empire's rise had been built on industrial strength, naval supremacy, and the exploitation of colonies. Its decline revealed the limits of all three. Industrial power shifted to the United States and later to other nations. Naval dominance was eroded by the rise of new technologies and rival fleets. Colonies, once subjugated, demanded independence, and Britain no longer had the means or the legitimacy to resist. The First World War dealt the first decisive blow. The cost in lives and money crippled Britain's economy and sowed the seeds of unrest in India, Ireland, and beyond. The interwar years exposed the weakness further, as Britain struggled with depression, nationalist movements, and rising global rivals. The Second World War delivered the final blow. Britain fought with courage and resilience, but the war left it bankrupt and dependent on the United States. Within a generation, the empire unraveled. The story of the empire's fall is also the story of the rise of others. The United States emerged as the global superpower, its economy and military unmatched. The Soviet Union became the other pole of power, challenging Western influence around the globe. Newly independent nations across Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean asserted their sovereignty, reshaping the global order. What had once been a world of empires became a world of nation-states. Yet the legacy of the British Empire endures. English became the world's most widely spoken language, the medium of diplomacy, science, and commerce. Parliamentary democracy, common law, and civil service systems left their mark on dozens of nations. The Commonwealth remains a symbolic network, linking former colonies and Britain in cooperation. Cultural exchange, migration, and shared history continue to bind people across continents. But the legacy is not only one of influence, it is also one of scars. The empire left behind borders drawn without regard to local realities, fueling conflicts in South Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. It imposed economic systems that often enriched Britain at the expense of colonies, leaving patterns of inequality. It used violence and repression to maintain control, memories of which remain vivid in former colonies. The empire's ghosts are both proud and painful, both achievements and injustices. For Britain itself, the loss of empire forced a reckoning. Without colonies to govern, it had to redefine its identity. Was it still a global power, tied to America in a special relationship? Was it European, joining the project of integration across the Channel? Or was it something else, an island nation with imperial memories but a diminished role? The debate over Britain's place in the world continues, shaped in part by the shadow of empire. The fall of the British Empire offers lessons about the nature of power. It shows that dominance is not eternal. Empires rise by adapting to the circumstances of their time, but they fall when they can no longer sustain the costs of control. They collapse when their subjects no longer consent, when their rivals surpass them, and when their resources are overstretched. It also reveals that decline can be both sudden and gradual. The First World War cracked the foundation. The Second World War broke the structure. Decolonization cleared the rubble. Yet, even as the empire disappeared, its influence lingered, reshaping the modern world in ways that remain with us today. Above all, the fall of the British Empire is a reminder of fragility, of how quickly the mightiest systems can unravel. The empire once believed it was eternal, a natural order of the world. But no empire is eternal. Each is bound by the limits of human ambition, economic reality, and the tide of history. Today, the British Empire exists only in memory and legacy. Its cities, railways, and institutions remain scattered across the globe. Its stories are told in textbooks, museums, and films. Its language connects billions. But the empire itself, the system of rule, of conquest, of global dominance, is gone. Its rise and fall stand as one of history's greatest dramas, a story of power and its inevitable fragility. The sun that once never set on the British Empire has long since gone down. What remains is the lesson that no empire, however vast, is immune to decline. The British Empire's story is not only about Britain, it is about the universal truth of history, that all empires fall.